I lived alone in a small apartment in the heart of the city. The place was cozy but old, with creaky wooden floors and high ceilings. It had a certain charm, though, especially the large balcony overlooking a quiet, leafy courtyard. I was drawn in by the low rent, and despite the slight chill that often ran through the rooms, even in summer, I figured it was just a quirk of the old building. Little did I know, that chill had a reason. The first week passed uneventfully. I spent my evenings watching TV or reading on the balcony, enjoying the calm. But on the 8th night, everything changed. It started with a faint noise, like someone speaking softly in the next room. First, I thought it was my neighbors. I knew the walls weren't the thickest, and sound tended to carry through them, especially at night. But the voices didn't seem to come from next door. They were coming from inside my living room. I turned off the TV and sat in silence, listening carefully. The voices grew louder, and soon, I could make out two distinct tones. One higher-pitched, almost shrill, and the other deep, rumbling like distant thunder. They were arguing. "I told you, it was 1937, barked the deeper voice. "No, it wasn't. It was 1939. You always get the dates wrong," snapped the other, sharper voice, brimming with irritation. The voices sounded as clear as if the people were standing right in front of me, but the room was empty. I slowly stood up, inching toward the hallway, convinced that my mind was playing tricks on me. Maybe I was just tired. Maybe it was the pipes or something rattling in the walls. But as I reached the door, I saw them. Two faint figures, semi-transparent, hovered just above the ground near the window. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothes. One, a tall man in a suit with a pocket watch dangling from his vest. The other, a short, plump woman in a flowered dress with a lace collar. They didn't even notice me standing there. They were too busy arguing. "You wouldn't know 1937 if it slapped you in the face," the woman shrieked, crossing her arms defiantly. "Ha! I was there, remember? You were the one too busy knitting or whatever it is you do to pay attention," the man retorted with a wave of his hand. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and blinked again. They were still there. Ghosts. In my apartment. Not haunting or threatening me, but bickering like an old married couple. "Excuse me," I finally managed to squeak out. Both ghosts stopped mid-argument and turned to look at me, their ethereal forms flickering slightly. The man adjusted his ghostly tie, and the woman narrowed her eyes at me. "Oh, great," she muttered. "Now you've done it. You've scared the poor guy." The man sighed dramatically. "Well, he is living here now. It was bound to happen sooner or later." I stared at them, my mind racing to comprehend the situation. Who are you? And what are you doing in my apartment?" The man gave a small bow. "I'm Charles, and this," he pointed to the woman who was still glaring at him, "is Margaret. We've been, let's say, residing here for quite some time." "Residing? You're ghosts," I blurted out, still unable to process what was happening. Margaret waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. We're not here to haunt you, if that's what you're worried about." Charles nodded, looking mildly offended. "We prefer to think of ourselves as long-term tenants. We've just hit a bit of a disagreement over the years." Margaret scoffed. "Decades, more like." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "Okay, but why are you arguing? And why every night?" Charles and Margaret exchanged a glance, then sighed in unison. "It's this blasted timeline," Margaret began, folding her arms again. "He insists that the shop across the street closed in 1937, but I know it was 1939. We've been debating it every night for... oh, I've lost count." "She's wrong," Charles said matter-of-factly. And I'll prove it, too. I just need more time to find the right evidence. Evidence? I asked, bewildered. Yes, Charles exclaimed, his eyes lighting up. Historical accuracy is important, you see. But unfortunately, we don't exactly have access to the local archives anymore. Margaret rolled her eyes. We're dead, Charles. Precisely, he said with a nod. But that doesn't mean we can't settle this once and for all. I sat down on the couch, staring at the two of them as they resumed their argument, completely ignoring me again. They were ghosts, but not in any way I'd ever imagined. They weren't scary or malicious, just loud and oddly persistent. Every night, it seemed, they appeared to continue their endless debate about trivial historical details. I could hardly believe it. Not only was I sharing my apartment with two ghosts, but they were the most annoyingly normal ghosts imaginable. And from that night on, they returned every evening, always at the same time, always with a new topic to argue about. Every evening, precisely at 10 o'clock, Charles and Margaret would materialize out of nowhere, like shadows gradually becoming solid. It was a moment I had come to dread, yet expect. No matter what I was doing, watching TV, making dinner, or even trying to go to bed early, their loud, heated argument over some trivial matter always shattered the peace of my evening. One night, Margaret was yelling louder than usual. "You can't even remember the name of that bookstore." "I remember everything perfectly," Charles retorted, adjusting his ghostly vest in frustration. "Oh, don't start with your details again, Charles. Details are all you have because you have no substance." Her voice was growing sharper by the second. Listening to them was both unbearable and amusing. They argued about such petty things that, had they not been ghosts, I'd have thought they were just a typical old married couple who could never agree on anything. One night it was the year the bookstore closed. Another time it was the date the courtyard fountain was built. They could go on for hours about who met whom first at a party in 1928. I had tried intervening before, but it always ended in more chaos. Either they ignored me completely, or they'd suddenly turn the argument on me, accusing me of not knowing my history. I gave up trying to reason with them. It was pointless. But one night, when I was nearly used to their noise, something different happened. That night, they were arguing more fiercely than usual. Margaret's voice was so loud that I was sure the neighbors could hear her, though, luckily, the noise seemed confined to my apartment. But it wasn't just the volume that was different. "Why can't we just leave this place?" Margaret suddenly yelled. Her voice filled not with anger, but with longing. It wasn't her usual outburst. This was real exhaustion. Charles fell silent. He looked at her with a long, heavy stare. "You know why, Margaret?" he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of sadness. "We're stuck here because we can't finish this." "Finish what?" I blurted out, finally daring to ask the question that had haunted me since their first appearance. Margaret's shoulders slumped as she turned to look at me for the first time since they'd entered my life. Her ghostly form, though transparent, seemed to radiate genuine sorrow. "We died, leaving things unfinished," she explained. "We lived in this house together, but we never resolved what really mattered. We just argued. And now, even after death, we can't find peace." Charles nodded solemnly. "Our arguments went on for so long, we don't even remember what started them. And now, we're bound to this place." I sat there, stunned by their story. It was so unexpected. The ghosts in my apartment weren't just caught up in historical squabbles. They were trapped in a never-ending cycle of conflict that had followed them beyond the grave. "So, if you could resolve your argument, you'd be able to leave?" I asked, unsure if I should feel relieved or worried about this revelation. Margaret sighed. "Maybe, but we can't agree. We just can't. You never admit when I'm right. Charles burst out again, though this time his voice lacked its usual confidence. He too was weary. And you never admit when I'm right. Margaret shot back, but without her usual venom. Her words sounded more like a simple statement of fact. I sat in the silence that followed, trying to figure out how to help them. Could it really be that two souls were stuck here simply because of their own stubbornness? And how was I supposed to solve what they couldn't in all these years? The next day, I woke up with a clear plan. If Charles and Margaret couldn't resolve their argument on their own, maybe they just needed an outside perspective. I spent the entire day in libraries and archives, trying to dig up any information I could about the bookstore, the fountain, and even that elusive year 1937 or 1939 they always fought about. But the city had changed so much over time, and many of the old buildings had been torn down. Some documents had been lost or were buried deep in archives no longer accessible. My hope began to wane. When I returned home, it was already 9 o'clock, 1 hour until their nightly appearance. I decided that tonight I would confront them seriously. It was time to find some kind of compromise, or at least try to get them to rise above their petty arguments and remember what really mattered. At exactly 10, they materialized once again in their usual fashion. Charles adjusted his cuffs, while Margaret crossed her arms, already bracing for another round of bickering. But this time I cut them off. "Listen to me," I said, louder than usual, trying to grab their attention. They both stopped and stared at me, surprised. "You can't move on until you resolve your argument, right?" Charles frowned but nodded. Margaret gave a weary nod as well. "Then maybe it's time to stop arguing about the details and remember why you started arguing in the first place. What was it that really connected you before you became like this?" Margaret and Charles exchanged a glance. The question seemed to catch them off guard. A deep silence filled the room. Margaret was the first to speak, her voice soft and uncertain. "I don't even remember." Charles shook his head, his expression troubled. "Neither do I." I stood there watching them. For the first time since I'd met these ghosts, they weren't bickering. They seemed lost in thought, perhaps searching their memories for something long forgotten. And then it hit me. What if their arguments were just a distraction, a way to avoid facing something deeper, something more painful? What if they were afraid to remember what had really kept them here all these years? "Maybe it's not about who was right or wrong," I suggested cautiously. "Maybe it's about what you're both avoiding." Margaret looked at me, her ghostly eyes wide with a mix of confusion and realization. Charles seemed to stiffen, his transparent form flickering slightly. "What are we avoiding?" Margaret whispered, almost to herself. I didn't have the answer, but I had a feeling they did. Somewhere, buried beneath decades of bickering, was the truth they had been running from. And if they could face it, maybe, just maybe, they could finally find peace. But that was a path they would have to walk together. As they stood there, lost in their thoughts, I wondered what secrets they had buried beneath their endless arguments, and whether they would ever be brave enough to uncover them. The following nights were unlike any I had experienced since the arrival of Charles and Margaret. There was no shouting, no bickering over meaningless details. Instead, they stood silently, deep in thought, as if struggling to recall something just beyond the edges of their memory. It was eerie, but also strangely peaceful. For the first time, my apartment didn't feel like a battleground. I watched them closely, not sure how long this reflective phase would last, but it was clear that something had shifted between them. Margaret's sharp tone had softened, and Charles no longer held himself with the same rigid defensiveness. They were still ghosts, yes, but they looked more human. On the third night of their unusual silence, I finally broke the quiet. "Do either of you remember how you first met?" I asked gently, hoping to stir something in their memories that might lead them closer to understanding why they were truly stuck here. Margaret blinked, as though waking from a trance. Her form flickered slightly, and she turned to Charles, her face clouded with confusion. "Do you remember, Charles?" Her voice was low, almost tentative. Charles looked down, his translucent hand resting on the edge of the mantelpiece. He seemed to struggle with his thoughts, his form flickering with the same uncertainty as Margaret's. I think it was at a dance," he finally said, his voice distant, as if he were pulling the memory from a fog. "It was one of those big parties they used to throw back in the day. Jazz music, laughter. I remember you were wearing a red dress." Margaret's eyes widened. "A red dress? No, Charles, it was blue. I always wore blue to those parties." I held my breath, expecting them to fall back into old habits, to argue about the color of her dress. But instead, Charles shook his head, smiling faintly. "Maybe you're right. It's hard to remember after all this time." Margaret's expression softened, and for a moment, they looked at each other not as rivals in an eternal debate, but as two people who had once shared something special. "That was the night we danced together for the first time," Margaret said quietly. "You were a terrible dancer." Charles chuckled, the sound low and warm, surprising even himself. "I was, but you didn't seem to mind." "I didn't," Margaret admitted, her ghostly form flickering softly. "I suppose that was one of the few things we agreed on." They both fell silent again, but this time the silence was different. It wasn't empty or hostile. It was filled with the weight of forgotten memories slowly surfacing. I could see it in their eyes. They were starting to remember the parts of their lives they'd buried beneath years of petty arguments. But I still had one question gnawing at me. If you two cared about each other, why did you end up fighting all the time? Why did it get so bad that it followed you even after death? Margaret turned away, drifting toward the window, her gaze lost in the darkness outside. Charles stayed by the mantel, his shoulders slumping as if burdened by an invisible weight. "It wasn't always like this," Charles said after a long pause. "We loved each other once, but life has a way of changing people. We lost something," Margaret murmured, still staring out the window. "I don't even remember when or how, but somewhere along the way, the arguments became more important than the love we once had." She paused, her ghostly hand brushing against the cold glass of the window. "We couldn't let go of being right. Every little disagreement became a battle we had to win, until that's all we knew how to do, fight." Charles nodded, his expression somber. "We grew so used to it that, by the time we realized what we'd lost, it was too late. And then we died." The room grew colder, as if the weight of their words had drawn in a chill from the past. I shivered, but not from fear, from sadness. I could see now that their endless arguments weren't just about historical dates or trivial memories. They were about something much deeper: regret, bitterness, and the fear of facing the truth that they had wasted so much of their time on things that didn't matter. I felt a lump forming in my throat, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I wasn't a therapist, and I certainly didn't know how to guide two souls trapped in a cycle of bitterness. But I knew one thing: they couldn't keep this up forever. What if? I hesitated, unsure if I was overstepping. What if you stopped trying to remember who was right? What if you just let it go? Margaret turned to face me, her ethereal form wavering slightly. Let it go. Charles frowned, looking as though the thought had never crossed his mind. How could we? We've been arguing for so long. I don't even know how to stop. You've already started, I said, my voice firmer now. You remembered something good tonight. You remembered how you met, how you danced. Maybe instead of focusing on what went wrong, you should focus on that. On the good things. on why you were together in the first place. They both stared at me, their spectral faces unreadable. For a moment, I thought I'd lost them, that they'd returned to their old habits, bound to repeat the same cycle for eternity. But then Margaret slowly nodded, her gaze softening. "He's right, Charles," she whispered. "We've been so caught up in fighting. We forgot why we stayed together for so long." Charles looked away, his form flickering, as if he was struggling to hold on to himself. But after a long pause, he sighed, his voice quiet but resigned. "Maybe it's time we stop." The room seemed to lighten, the oppressive cold lifting slightly. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me, as if a burden had been lifted, not just from them, but from the apartment itself. For the first time since they had started appearing, there was a glimmer of hope that they could find peace. That night, after Charles and Margaret had disappeared, I found myself lying in bed, wide awake. I should have felt a sense of accomplishment, or at least relief, but something still gnawed at me. Their shift in behavior was promising, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this, something neither of them was fully facing yet. The next evening, when they reappeared, I sensed a difference immediately. They weren't arguing. They weren't even bickering. Instead, they stood together, close but not touching, like two figures who had once known intimacy but had long since forgotten what it felt like. I sat down across from them, determined to push just a little further. "You've both come a long way," I said slowly, watching their reactions. "But there's still something holding you back, isn't there?" Margaret glanced at Charles, her expression unreadable. Charles shifted uneasily but didn't respond. "What happened, Margaret?" I pressed, my voice gentle but firm. "What's the real reason you're still here?" For a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. But then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. Charles tensed, his face hardening. "Margaret," we agreed. "No," she interrupted, her voice trembling. "No more lies, Charles. We can't move on until we face it." I leaned forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "Face what?" Margaret's ghostly figure flickered as if struggling to maintain its form. When she spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. It wasn't an argument about dates or history that ruined us. It was the child. The air in the room grew thick, almost suffocating. Margaret continued, her voice heavy with sorrow. "We lost our child, and I blamed him for it. I couldn't let go of that grief. I made everything about the arguments so I didn't have to face the pain." Tears welled in my eyes, and for the first time, I truly understood the depth of their suffering. They weren't trapped because of petty disputes. They were trapped by unresolved grief, buried beneath years of denial and anger. Charles finally spoke, his voice breaking. "I blamed myself too, but instead of helping her, pushed her away. And we just kept fighting." Silence fell over the room. It was a silence filled with years of unspoken pain, of lost love and missed chances. They had spent so long running from their grief that it had chained them to this place, forcing them to relive their unresolved bitterness for eternity. I took a deep breath, steadying myself before speaking. "Maybe now you can forgive each other." Margaret turned to Charles, her ghostly hand reaching out toward him. "I'm sorry, Charles. I should have told you that years ago. I should have let you in." Charles looked at her, his expression softening for the first time in what seemed like forever. "And I'm sorry, too. I failed you, and I failed our child." Their forms flickered, the tension in the room easing as they slowly reached for each other, their fingers almost touching. In that moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Their ghostly hands reached out, the space between them narrowing, as if after all these years, they might finally connect, might finally feel the touch that had eluded them for so long. Margaret's fingers trembled as they hovered near Charles's. He hesitated, his form flickering slightly, before reaching out further. For the first time since they had appeared in my apartment, I sensed something more than frustration or regret. I sensed hope. "I missed you," Margaret whispered, her voice fragile and full of years of unspoken pain. Even after everything, Charles swallowed hard, his ghostly chest rising and falling in a mimicry of breath. "I missed you too," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I just didn't know how to fix it. I thought we had lost each other for good." A soft light began to fill the room, not the harsh flicker of their earlier appearances, but a warm, gentle glow that seemed to come from them both. The temperature in the apartment rose slightly, and I could feel the weight of their unresolved sorrow lifting, as if the very air had become lighter. Then, finally, their hands touched. It was a simple, tentative touch, but it seemed to spark something in the air, like the meeting of two forces that had been separated for far too long. Their ghostly forms shimmered and grew more defined, more solid, as though this act of connection was pulling them back into something resembling life. "I forgive you," Margaret said, her voice steady now, filled with a peace I hadn't heard in all the nights they had argued in my home. "I've held on to this pain for so long, but it wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault." Charles looked at her, his face softening with the same acceptance. "And I forgive you, Margaret, for the things we said, for everything we lost. We both carried that grief alone, when we should have carried it together." They stood there, still holding hands, their eyes locked on each other. The soft glow around them grew brighter, filling the room with a warmth I hadn't felt since moving in. I could see it in their eyes now. This wasn't just the end of their argument. This was the end of the years they had spent punishing themselves, the release they had been denied for so long. I stood there, watching in awe as their forms became brighter, more ethereal, until I could barely make out their faces. The light enveloped them, and I could feel something shift in the very fabric of the room, like a knot being untied after years of tension. "Is this it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you leaving?" Margaret turned to me, her face soft and kind, no longer twisted in frustration or anger. "Thank you," she said. "You helped us see what we couldn't see ourselves." Charles nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We're finally ready to go. We couldn't have done it without you." I wanted to say something more, but my throat tightened with emotion. I could only nod, feeling both relief and sadness wash over me. I had grown accustomed to their nightly visits, their presence, even their arguments. And now they were finally going to leave. As the light surrounding them grew even brighter, I shielded my eyes. The room filled with a soft, shimmering glow, and then, just as suddenly as they had appeared all those nights ago, they were gone. The apartment fell silent. The coldness that had always seemed to linger in the air was gone too, replaced by a warmth that felt peaceful. I stood in the middle of the room, staring at the spot where they had been, still trying to wrap my mind around what had just happened. They were gone. Charles and Margaret, the two ghosts who had turned my life upside down, had finally moved on.